I was happily watching the Spurs beat the Lakers a couple of months back, when something in the broadcast didn't seem right to me. I had to go and rewind this, because, what even is this? What is it? You've got, the longest guy in the league, and this is the plushie you decide to make of him? It's not right. I don't think I was wrong in the moment. This is a league full of the longest, most athletic people in the world, and the Spurs have the longest among them in Victor Wembanyama, a human whose reach is so wide that I think about him every time I handle a sheet of plywood, knowing that he could fit an entire sheet between his fingertips the long way. I found myself thinking about it for the next few days, and I somehow managed to convince myself that it'd be quite a fun sewing project to have a go at making something myself. To get the project started, I found some fabric that looked like it wasn't a complete insult to Wemby's skin colour, and also found some that might work for his hair. Even once I had the fabric, it still took me a couple of weeks to get the bonina out and start working on the project. I decided the place to start would probably be with his head, as I figured that would be the most difficult part. I did some sketches to try and come up with a simplified version of Wemby's face, and once I got something that I thought was acceptable, it was time to start sewing. I had a guess at making a pattern for it and started stitching some pieces together. As usual, I find the process of sewing completely unintelligible and think it looks like absolutely nothing. But I added a bit here and a bit there, and when I turned it out, it began looking alright. After tinkering with the design a little bit more and stitching it back together and putting some more stuffing in it, it had at least a passing resemblance to him. So it might have been a bit like rushing to dessert before eating your vegetables, but I decided I should paint his facial features on. It actually looked alright, but the most unacceptable thing about it was about twice as big as I was intending. There were other things I didn't like as well, so I decided to go back to the drawing board and have another go. And I quickly realised that I had a case of serious beginner's luck with the first one that I made, because I went through so many iterations of trying to make this head, abandoning ship on them because I felt they looked more like his teammates than Wembanyama himself. I feel like maybe I've bit off a bit more than I can chew on this project, and I've basically not even started either. I am starting with the hardest part, but it is way more difficult than I expected it to be, and it's requiring so much more iteration than I thought it would as well. I'm finding it really hard to motivate myself to keep plugging away at it. I'm not even sure if it's worth it for such a trivial project. I found myself actively avoiding working on the project, and I drove all the way to Scotland to get away from it for a few days. With the benefit of a bit of time off, I came back to it and decided to have two more attempts at making his head before I got something that I thought was acceptable. I still felt like I could do better, but considering this was a project that I started by assuming I'd spend maybe a weekend on it, and was already a couple of weeks into making an absolute mess of my office with the sewing machine, I decided that this one would be good enough, so I had another go at painting his face on. And in doing so, I realised that returning to the stitched nose made a big difference. I guess the inspiration for even thinking I could make this was some of the plush toys that I've made most recently, which are robots with really long limbs themselves. I moved on to Wemby's limbs and took a wild guess at how long they should be relative to his head. So I stitched them together, and then I had the idea of adding a bit of armature inside them so they wouldn't just be completely floppy. Of course, despite this being a sewing project, this was a good excuse to head down to the workshop, where I had some leftover twin and earth wire that would be absolutely perfect for this job. I cut a section off, and then I managed to wangle a little bit of the earth line out of the middle of the wire, which would give some posability to his opposable thumbs as well. I then put a blob of hot glue over the end of the wire where I'd cut it off and it was a little bit sharp, and threaded it into the arms that I made. And it seemed to work out surprisingly well. I even made an effort to make the sleeve that he always has over his right arm, and found myself beginning to believe in this project a little bit more. The legs followed suit, and they weren't particularly interesting because he's always been wearing leggings this season at least. But I did make an effort with the detail to add the knee pads like his leggings have. The shoes, I have to admit, were really uninspired and they look a little bit Mickey Mouse, but I figured that they would kind of be the last thing that defined this toy, so it didn't really matter too much. And I did the same trick with some of that twin and earth wire as armature, feeding them into the legs. So with all of his limbs made, the next thing to do was his torso. I quickly sketched out how big I thought this should be, again relative to the other body parts, and began working on his jersey as the main bulk of his torso. This came together alright, although it was a bit of a puzzle to work out how much detail I should be putting into it. I think I got the balance right with the detail, but some of the execution wasn't quite right. A couple of pieces were a bit short here or there, and I realised it was going to be a bit of a puzzle for how I even attached these limbs into it. Having been through about 6 iterations with the head, I decided that it really wouldn't take that much effort to go through a second iteration with this torso as well. And so I gave it another shot and felt like I was getting better results. Even having redone it, it still was a bit of a puzzle for sewing his arms in. I really didn't want to go to the effort of removing the armature, but I had to do it a few times to get the right access to the fabrics where I needed them, and then threaded it all back together. I also had to stitch up a couple of little details where my sewing was, shall I say, lacking, but all of this fleecy fabric was definitely forgiving enough that doing it by hand was totally acceptable, and my bad hand stitching basically disappeared. I decided that I should probably tie the armatures together a little bit, so I managed to twist them up in a kind of loop that I hoped I could sort of run around the neck of the head that I made. I'm not sure how much this ended up working by the time I'd ended up stitching his head onto the body, but it was definitely a good idea to tether them so the arms would play with one another a little better. I could kind of see the finish line in sight at this point, and that was a good thing because I was getting so fed up with this project. I'd started the sewing almost a month ago at this point and had been thinking about it for closer to 3 months at this point as well. I figured that his shorts could be my saviour, and after attaching his legs together like I did with the arms, I did a really quick and dirty job of stitching the legs into the torso, knowing I could hide all of my terrible workmanship in his shorts. I drew up a little pattern for a pair of shorts that I hoped would be the right size. I managed to wrestle them onto him, but once I'd got them on him, it was clear that they were a bit too skinny around the legs, and it proved to be easier to just cut through the seams of the parts that I needed to replace than to try and pull the shorts off of his legs. I made a couple of new panels for the shorts and a couple of other adaptations, and after a test fit they were a bit more acceptable. There was one more adaptation that I felt like I needed to make though, which was to add a bit of armature to effectively work as his spine, going all the way up through his head, as his head was proving to be a little bit floppy. This seemed like such a gruesome job to have to skewer him, but again the fact that I could hide some of my sins under his shorts proved to be a winner for me. But with the sewing all done, I could move on to the part of the project that was much more in my comfort zone, which was painting all the details onto his uniform. And that allowed me to tidy up and put the banana away. I'm definitely no stranger of making my own t-shirts, and I do have a horrible problem of doing a great design and then managing to get it a little bit wonky once it's on my t-shirt. So in this case, I took a couple of images of the lettering on his uniform and then made myself some masking tape guidelines for where they needed to be before I started painting. I'm definitely no stranger to painting straight onto materials, but this fleece was particularly unrewarding to paint on. And painting white on black is always kind of the worst idea as well, because you have to build up a few coats before it actually starts looking white. It did start looking really good though, and I even went to the effort of painting the little detail on of the NBA logo, and then the little golden badge that San Antonio has on the back of their neckline for the championships they've won as well. And painting the white stripes onto the silver side panels made it look less like a bad counterfeit. The front was even more difficult, even with my guidelines. The Spur logo in the middle seemed like such a mess, but it was also totally legible and recognisable as their logo, so I felt like I kind of won that one. A couple more details followed on his shorts in the same vein, and adding a couple of swooshes to his terrible, terrible feet also improved them a little bit. And I think I was about ready to call this project done. It's turned out way differently to how I expected. I think the biggest part of that was my choice to put armature in him rather than just letting him be all soft and floppy. He looks much more like a model, like something you'd use in an animation, than a plushie, which I guess kind of makes sense. But it does, in my opinion, look a lot more like him than the plushie that set me off on this whole terrible mission anyway. It's a funny one because you have to draw the line between detail and simplicity when you make a project like this. It definitely has a bit more of that handmade charm to it that I was hoping for. It felt like this project took me an absolute age. At least I can stop thinking about it now. But I am really pleased that I managed to get it finished before the playoffs start, so we'll see how Wemby does in those. Thanks for watching. Keep it real.